As they start to get closer to, fourth, fifth grade, this is when, because the Earth has gone around the sun a few more times, we start to see a change. And the easiest way for me to explain this transition from grammar to logic stage, and this is exposing some of my parenting techniques, which you may or may not agree with, is that if a second grader says to you, "Is a robber going to break into the house tonight?" you do not actually tell them the truth. Because the truth would be statistically unlikely, right? You don't say that because they would never sleep again. You say, "No, go to bed. Everything's fine." Now, if your fifth grader says to you, "Is a robber going to break into the house tonight?" and you say, "No," you know what they say to you? "How do you know?" Yeah, exactly. Because they have seen patterns repeat often enough to know that sometimes patterns get broken. They've listened to the news. They've talked to their friends. They know that the simple reassurance is not going to do it. It's not going to fix the problem. So instead of saying to them, "No, nobody's going to break into the house," you say, "Statistically unlikely." You can do that with a fifth grader. And then you got to tell them what the plan is. But if somebody did break into the house tonight, we would call 911. Your father would come downstairs with a baseball bat, whatever nonviolent solution you prefer. You tell them what the plan would be if the pattern got broken. Critical thinking is the ability to recognize patterns and the ability to understand why patterns break and what to do about it. Okay? So there's this deep emotional need that elementary students have for sameness and repetition, but that middle grade students have for analysis and the ability to make a plan. It's about far more than academics. This has to do with the development of the whole person. But they need to recognize patterns and to be able to cope with the breaking of the patterns. I did the same thing, by the way, when my kids asked me if I was going to die, when they were really little. And they'd say, "Are you going to die?" And I'd say, "No, go to bed." Right. And then when they got a little older, I said, I'm in good health. I wear my seatbelt, so unlikely, but what they were really asking is, what happens if the pattern's broken? What's going to happen to me? But if something does happen to us, you get to go live with Uncle Bob and Aunt Heather in Seattle. And they got really excited about that. I had to remind them I would, in fact, be dead for the scenario to work its way out. But that's what they need. And classical educators should never forget that, the goal is to teach students to understand and deal with life. That's what education is about. It is equipping them to deal with life. So as we move into the logic stage in our teaching, now is the time to focus on recognizing those patterns because they've got that basic information to build off of. And it is also, and we'll talk about the subjects in a minute, it is also in this time that we can start thinking a little bit more about the next two of the second and third of the cardinal virtues. And those are prudence and courage. Temperance, in the sense of being able to exercise maturity, do what you don't necessarily want to do because it's important. We can begin teaching that to elementary school students. But prudence is the ability to discern an appropriate course of action for a given situation. It's practical wisdom. And courage is the ability to confront fear, uncertainty, and intimidation. It is the ability to master our fears when looking at an unknown future and to progress forward despite those fears. Both of those require moral fiber, but they also require the ability to analyze and to evaluate and to plan. And it's not necessarily appropriate, in my opinion, to ask elementary students to develop those qualities. A second grader is not going to be prudent until they've got a little more experience. It is unfair of us to ask a third grader to be courageous until they have the maturity to understand how plans change, how patterns break, and what to do about it. Now, of course, one of the great challenges of teaching logic stage kids is that they get very, very impatient with repetition at a time when they still really need it. They get bored quickly because they are maturing out of the time when repetition is going to be their primary way of learning. So one of our challenges as teachers, and particularly in a classroom setting, is to keep repetition as part of the curricula during this transition, but to not make it the primary method of teaching. One of my theories about why girls tend to stay engaged in the classroom during the middle grades more frequently than boys do is that, particularly when you've got a largish group of students, the easiest thing to do, and when I say easy, I don't mean that to sound like a criticism, sometimes the only practical thing to do, is to stay in grammar stage teaching, which means you say, here's the information, repeat it back to me. It is much simpler to do that than to begin to dialogue with students, because I have taught middle grade students, and dialoguing with middle grade students can be a hot mess. I am aware of that. So particularly if you've got a large classroom, and I think this happens in a lot of undersourced public schools, there's no practical way to move towards dialogue with the students. You stay in lecture mode, which is grammar stage learning. And eventually your middle grade student they're just gonna shut off because they're bored, because it's an inappropriate way to teach this level. Girls will tend, in most cases, to stay engaged a little bit longer than boys because they tend to be socialized to be pleasers and they want the teacher to like them. Not all of them, but more of them. But I think that's one of the reasons why it is harder to keep middle grade boys engaged in a classroom setting. So we just have to be so alert to the fact that the repetition in our teaching has to decrease. And however we do it, and again, we'll talk some more about practicalities in the next session, we have to engage them more in conversation, challenge them to recognize patterns rather than simply feeding them the information. Now, a few of these things that change as we're teaching our middle grade students is this is the time to introduce the actual formal study in some way of logic principles. That doesn't have to be symbolic logic, but at least expose them to categories of argumentation, to fallacies. In literature, now it is appropriate to start asking them questions like, why do you think this character acted in this particular way? They've got enough maturity now, they've got enough exposure to literature to have some possible answers to start to slot in as an answer to that question. You know, you ask a second grader why about any character, why do you think the character did that? You're just going to get a blank look because they don't know why they do what they do. So they really don't know why a character in a book does what they do. But by the middle grade, you've got more experience. They've got more of a bank to draw on. You can ask questions about characters, plots, motivations, techniques. In spelling, we should start to see, at this point, an increasing application of rules to written work. You should be seeing that gap between the subjects narrow as the students gain an ability to think abstractly. In grammar, there are two very important parts of the curriculum: diagramming and outlining. I'm going to talk a little bit about diagramming in the next session if I have a chance. But what diagramming does is it draws a chart of the logical relationship between different words in a sentence. It shows you how meaning comes out of relationships between words. So it's critical thinking in practice when you have them diagram a sentence. Outlining does the same thing, but on the thought level, on the composition level, as opposed to on the sentence level. You're drawing a chart of the logical relationship between the ideas in a piece of writing. And then that is something that students can begin to use as they compose. I think that outlines have very, very limited use for elementary school students. They really belong in this logic dialectic part of education. And then in mathematics, we're going to see students start to move towards abstraction, towards pre-algebra and algebra.